It doesn't matter what type of Christian you're dealing with or any time. You could look back across the long scope of Christian history and you would find that there's one event that is central, foundational, pivotal, I would say, to the Christian faith, to the Christian message, the Christian gospel. And that is the Welcome to Deep Wells. In today's episode, we're really going to pick up where we left off in our prior episode. In that episode, we were dealing with the question, is Jesus God? Is Jesus the Son of God? And those two questions are the first and second, respectively, most popular questions in the Google search for is Jesus. Is Jesus God or is Jesus the Son of God? And in our last episode, just to kind of recap, I'd encourage you to go back and listen, watch. But we looked at the New Testament evidence that Jesus himself claimed to be God. He claimed to be divine. Then we looked at other books in the New Testament that show that Christians right from the beginning understood Jesus to be God. They believed him to be God. We looked at evidence from outside the Bible as well, outside of the New Testament. We looked at early Christian writers and also even non-Christian writers, even antagonistic to the Christian movement. But they made clear that right from the beginning, right from the earliest stage of the Christian movement, Christians at least understood and accepted Jesus to be God, and those claims are documented. So the idea that it was some type of a later accretion to Christianity, this idea that somehow Jesus never claimed to be God, but that later on these layers of myth and hagiography just built up and built up until finally the Orthodox Christian position was that Jesus claimed to be God when that was not the historical fact. All of that we really dispelled. I feel that it would really help you to understand, if you haven't already listened to that episode, to go back and watch the first installation. But today we're going to pick up the question, is Jesus God? And I really want to go at it from a central event, a pivotal foundation for Christianity. It doesn't matter what type of Christian you're dealing with or any time. You could look back across the long scope of Christian history and you would find that there's one event that is central, foundational, pivotal, I would say, to the Christian faith, to the Christian message, the Christian gospel, and that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The claim that Jesus died and he rose again is the backbone of the entire Christian message. But I would like to ask the question, maybe you're asking it, you've had it posed to you, was the claim that a deity or a religious figure rose from the dead unique? Was that a unique claim to Christianity, or can we find that in other mythologies, other religions, etc.? Well, frankly, the answer to that question is no, it was not a unique claim. It was not a unique claim. We find the claim of resurrection in, for example, the Egyptian mythologies of Osiris and Horus. And in popular sentiment in recent times has been this deity known as Mithras. And there's the claim, it's very popular in current dialogue, that Mithras was some type of an antitype, a prior iteration, if you will, of what later became the Christian message. The idea that Mithras was really just a precedent that was set in that belief system that then later informed Christianity. Some of the skeptics claim that Mithras was buried in a tomb, after 3 days rose again, and that Mithras was celebrated each year, the time of his resurrection, which later became Easter. And so if you took it at face value, that would sound very, very like bad news for the Christian message. It would look like Christianity was just an imitation of this prior Mithraic mythology. But the truth of the matter is that there's nothing in the Mithraic tradition, the tradition of Mithras, that indicates that Mithras even died, let alone that he ever rose again. It's interesting that Mithras, that tradition is documented very early through a Christian writer. You've probably heard of him, Tertullian. And Tertullian would date from around 200 AD, a very early Christian writer. And he's an early witness to this Mithraic mythology, this Mithraic belief system. And in his writings, he documents for us that the Mithraic believers would actually reenact resurrection scenes. But what he wrote about was occurring well after the New Testament times. And so what it actually appears like is that the Mithraic tradition actually, rather than informing Christianity, it actually was imitating Christianity. And interesting, if you're interested in more of that, we don't have a lot of time to go into that today. I want to focus on some other things, but if you're interested in more of that, one good resource that I recommend if you're interested to learn more about this is from J. Warner Wallace, and you can find his website at Cold Case Christianity. J. Warner Wallace, he's got articles to this effect and wrote a book to this effect, but he'll break it down much more than I'm able to do today. But the point of the matter is that at first face, some of these other mythologies, the claims make them sound very much in line with what we read about in the Christian gospel, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But upon closer examination, they don't bear the marks of historicity, for one, but they also don't even resemble nearly as much as is claimed Christianity. They're not such a cut and dry reflection of Christianity or the Christian gospel. And these mythologies are just that. They're myths. They sound incredible, as they should. They're not based on history. They're not tightly bound to history. And a lot of people would throw the claims of the New Testament, the claims about Jesus Christ, into the same bucket of mythology. They would say, well, hey, there's no real historic backing for any of this. It's just mythologies, it's just people's sentiments and their wishes. But I would ask the question, is there any evidence for the resurrection? These other claims, these other mythologies don't have that mark of historicity. And obviously, skeptics today would find the resurrection of Jesus Christ to be equally incredible if there is no evidence. So the question again, is there any evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ? And I would say that compared to these mythical figures and their resurrections, that Jesus' resurrection bears the marks of historicity. So I want to look at some of the evidence, the textual evidence that we find, some of the circumstances that really lend historicity, they lend weight, they lend evidence to this Christian belief right from the beginning that Jesus Christ not only lived and not only died on the cross, but that he actually rose again, just as he had foretold on the third day. He rose from the dead. Well, what is some of this evidence I'm talking about? Well, first of all, we can consider the testimony of the four gospel writers. We have four different accounts that are part of the Christian canon. They're part of the accepted corpus of writings that Christians have really accepted right from the beginning: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each of these four gospel writers, from their perspective, from their history, from their authorial intent, even depending on the circumstances they're writing, depending on the intended audience to which they're writing, each of these four gospel writers, all of them agree that Jesus died and rose again. So that's uniform through the four. There's a lot of variation, there's a lot of elements in this parables of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus, the early life of Jesus, where maybe there's not so much coincidence between the four, but on the point of the resurrection, all four of these New Testament writings, all four of these gospels, as they're called, attest to this fact that Jesus died, was buried, and rose again on the third day. They're all similar in that regard. They're all self-consistent. Now, again, these are different perspectives, different angles, just as what we would expect if you had different eyewitnesses to a crime or to an event. You know, as you look at it at face value, initially it could seem like there's contradictory accounts, contradictory evidence, contradictory claims, but none of those claims stand up to scrutiny. When you put all of it together, when you take those four accounts and you overlap them and look at them taken together, there is one consistent witness to the resurrection and the events that surrounded that miraculous event. I think that's very interesting. Matthew and John, who wrote those respective gospels, they were actual eyewitnesses. They were actually among the 12 original disciples, the original apostles of Jesus Christ, his earliest followers. Luke and Mark, who wrote the other two gospels, were not among the initial 12, but they were early followers of Jesus. Some claim that John Mark was the young man in Gethsemane who ran away naked, fled the scene of Jesus' arrest. I'm not sure if that's the case or not, but we do know that John Mark, as he's known, and Luke were both very early witnesses, very early writers that documented what the church, what the early Christians held, documented it very meticulously. Luke, in particular, even when held up to scrutiny against other ancient historians, he's recognized, even by secular people, as a very top rate historian. And so, even though Luke and Mark may not have been eyewitnesses to the resurrection themselves, they certainly knew eyewitnesses and documented in line with that. And we have that corroboration of four different accounts, four different gospel records that show the facts of the resurrection of Jesus. And so it was not documented, and this is an important point. The gospel writers did not write in the style of mythologists. They did not write in the style of hagiographers. They didn't write in the style of those who are just painting some idealized picture. There's concrete evidence with real flesh and blood people, names, places, all along the way that really extract these gospel accounts from any association with myth. They're not told as myth. These are told, recounted as eyewitness accounts. I think that's very important. They list certain people by name, co-witnesses of the resurrection. And, you know, it's interesting. Just think about it from a practical standpoint. If I was going to make up some story and try to put it across, this falsification, to put it across as truth, why would I list specific people and give so much data that people that read my account could then take and go to scrutinize it, to investigate it further, and find out that the whole thing was just chock full of lies? Well, obviously, I wouldn't do that. And I don't believe that the gospel writers did that either. I believe that the reason that they confidently wrote down specific people, specific places, was so that the people that read their accounts, their gospels, could then go back if they were in that area and they could actually find these people. They could actually interview them themselves. It's interesting that in Luke's gospel, at the beginning, he indicates to us that that's exactly what he did, that he actually went around and spoke to eyewitnesses and gathered their accounts, interviewed them, documented meticulously, and then collated that information and put it into the narrative that we have today as the Gospel of Luke. So clearly, these New Testament writers had confidence that the individuals that they mention were reliable witnesses to this supernatural event of the resurrection. Interestingly, not one of the Gospel authors alleged to have been a lone witness of some type of singular apparition. Not one of them claimed that Jesus appeared to me. First of all, that's interesting because, what would give you better street cred, as we might say today, than to claim that Jesus rose from the dead and he came to you personally. He appeared and brought you some special message, and that would really prop up your ego, puff your ego. It maybe help your book sell a little bit better. But none of them do that. Not one of the gospel writers takes that step or makes that claim. They all claim that their testimony is supported by many other witnesses, co-witnesses, people. They really relied on the testimony of others, not just their own testimony. I think that's interesting. What's also interesting is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Paul, specifically the Apostle Paul, all claim that Jesus was seen by the 11 the 11 remaining apostles. So there were 12. Initially, Judas betrayed Jesus and hung himself, died, apostatized. But the 11 that remained, Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospel, and then additionally the writing to the first letter to the Corinthians that we have from Paul, all of those writings claim that the 11 saw Jesus appear to them at the same time. At the same time. Now, that's interesting. You know, uh, we've all heard about people that have had hallucinations. We've all heard about medications, drugs, chemicals that can induce hallucinations, trances. It's not hard for us to understand that one person could have some type of a psychological crisis, maybe in the midst of their grief, who knows, and just imagine that they saw someone after they died. In fact, it's not that uncommon for that to occur. What is very uncommon, very, very irregular, very, very unheard of, is that 11 people would have an identical hallucination all at the same time. And that's exactly what we read about. We read that the 11 saw Jesus appear to them not once, but multiple times at the same time. They're all witnessing the same event. So it really pulls it out, in my viewpoint, from the realm of just a hallucination. It had to have been a real apparition, a real appearance of Jesus resurrected from the dead. So the critics would say, well, yeah, the 11 agreed. Of course, they agreed it was just all an elaborate conspiracy. And we've all heard of these types of conspiracy theories where people get together and they just collude and agree what the official line is going to be. But then the question becomes that if that were true, if you played that out, if it really was just the 11 apostles getting together and weaving this big story, this big narrative, what would be their purpose in doing that? What would they stand to gain by making up such a story? Would they get fame? Would they get prestige? Would they get financial gain? Well, when we look at what's in the Bible itself, you look at the aftermath of the resurrection that's documented in the book of Acts, you read about Paul the Apostle's difficulties that he talks about in his letters. You read about early Christian witnesses, early historians of the Christian movement that leave us these traces, these accounts of persecution, the difficulty, the rejection by society that Christians underwent. And you realize that the apostles had nothing to gain and everything to lose by claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. And that's exactly what they claimed. Even to their deaths, they claimed it. It's interesting that historians tell us that of the 11 faithful apostles that remained with Jesus, 10 of them, every one of them except for John the Beloved, 10 of them died by torture, by execution, by martyrdom. Now, doesn't it seem like when all they were being asked to do would be to deny that Jesus had really risen from the dead, to deny that he was Lord, to deny that he was the King of Kings coming back again in glory, all they had to do to stop that torture, stop that eventual martyrdom, would be to deny that. to deny what they had seen, to deny what they had claimed. And yet they went to their deaths, brutal deaths, and they never forsook that. They never pulled back on that claim. I think that's powerful. I think that that's very instructive, frankly. They died declaring that Jesus had risen from the dead. We also look at Saul of Tarsus. He's better known today as Paul the Apostle. Well, Saul of Tarsus was one of the top persecutors, one of the greatest antagonists of the burgeoning Christian movement. He was dead set on persecuting, arresting, and even killing Christians. He wanted to snuff out this heresy, as he saw it, this aberration from traditional Judaism. He, as a Pharisee, trained in Jewish law, trained in the Jewish customs, he wanted to uphold that and to snuff out this aberration, this false Judaism, as he saw it, this false Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, and this movement that had cropped up around him. And so he's dead set on exterminating this movement and killing it. And yet, in an encounter that's documented in the book of Acts, Saul of Tarsus himself experiences this appearance of Jesus resurrected from the dead, and it changes his whole life. It changes his whole trajectory. And Paul, just like the others I mentioned, he went to torture and death, and he would never deny what he had seen. He would never deny that Jesus was truly risen from the dead. So there's so much that's there. You can read about in his letter to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 6, Paul says that Jesus was seen alive after his crucifixion. He was seen risen from the dead after his death and burial by over 500 people at the same time. Now, that's a pretty stout claim. And remember, 1 Corinthians was probably written conservatively in the 50s of our era, in the middle of the first century, just within a few years of Jesus' earthly life and ministry. And Paul is saying, hey, he appeared resurrected to over 500 people at the same time. And then he even makes the claim that the majority of those were still alive at the time of his writing. It was almost like he was challenging his opponents. Hey, go check it out. Go look these people up. There's over 250 of them out there, and I'm one of them. These ones that saw Jesus alive. It's amazing. But, you know, the interesting thing to me, and maybe we'll do an episode at some point on miracles, the question of miracles. There's all kinds of opinions on that. I think probably, if we're honest, most of us have experienced or heard about something that is a credible miracle, something that just it defies rather scientific explanation. I know I've seen so many things like that, and the truth is that the miracles that we would expect to accompany Jesus Christ of Nazareth, if he really were resurrected, those types of miracles, I've seen them with my own eyes. I've seen them around the world, things that I can't explain, things that you can't just tidily explain away. I've seen those things. I've experienced those things. Maybe we'll get to talk more about those at another time, but I'm convinced that these miracles are exactly what we would expect to see if Jesus truly is resurrected from the dead, as I believe and as faithful Christians believe and have believed for 2,000 years. I believe that Jesus Christ truly conquered death. I've seen those miracles with my own eyes. So, did Jesus rise from the dead? Is Jesus God as he claimed to be? Well, as a Christian, I'm convinced that the answer to both of those questions is yes. And whatever your opinion of Jesus Christ is, I think we can agree that he was the most pivotal figure in human history. Whatever your opinion of him, whatever your opinion of his claims, whatever your thoughts about the resurrection that we've been talking about today, I think that just looking at it objectively, if you were to pick one person that had the greatest impact on human history across the board, it would have to be Jesus Christ of Nazareth. and I'd commend him to your consideration.